O Christopher Hampton já tem uma história com os Açores, porque nasceu cá na Ilha do Faial, e eu contatei-o há 3 anos atrás. E levou mais de 2 anos para receber uma resposta. Pronto, ela é uma super estrela no seu meio e eu não sabia se eu ia conseguir, uma resposta dele. Mas depois, quando ele respondeu tão positivamente sobre a ideia de vir à sua terra de nascimento, eu fiquei contentíssimo e então comecei a planear um momento especial. E ele disse que ia vir mesmo cá com a família, iam passar uma semana de férias no Faial, e isso foi fantástico para nós, para a Mira até cá, dos Açores Fringe, e também para os Açores, porque tivemos cá o único vencedor de um Oscar que nasceu nos Açores. O Christopher, com a sua família, saíram quando ele tinha apenas 2 anos de idade, por isso ele nunca mais tinha vindo cá. E estava a celebrar os seus 70 anos de idade, e já mais de 50 anos de carreira como dramatista, cineasta e também em termos de realizador de teatro. E ele adorou os Açores. Ele diz que a ilha o incentivou a voltar e até talvez escrever qualquer coisa sobre os Açores. Vamos ver o que é que se pode sair no futuro. Boa noite.
Boa noite.
Today, of course, we will be speaking in English to our
That's
audience.
a relief.
And to start, basically, Fayal, this island,
Yes.
Egypt, Zanzibar, England, all of this was your childhood. Do you want to tell us a little bit about?
Yes, well, the one part of my childhood I unfortunately don't remember is being here. So it's wonderful to be back after nearly 70 years, because I was a baby when my father, who worked for a company called Cable and Wireless, left Fayal and then went to Aden, which was the next place I spent some time, and then for 5 years in Alexandria in Egypt. And then there was a thing called the Suez Crisis, which meant that it somehow began to seem not so secure to travel around the world as an Englishman. So I was sent back to school in England, and my father went to Hong Kong, and then he went to Zanzibar. But it made for a very interesting childhood, and the kind of childhood that's particularly, I think, useful for a writer to have, the kind of childhood that makes you a sort of a permanent outsider, in a way, which is, so you're always outside looking in to different societies, and that's a very good education for a writer.
Because you're always traveling, even in your work, you're basically traveling, right?
Well, absolutely, but also it is this sort of outsiderness that was so that in Egypt I was an English boy at a school called the British Boys' School, which I seem to be the only British boy, and therefore, particularly in the political circumstances at the time, which was that the Egyptians were trying to liberate themselves from any kind of English influence. So that there one was an outsider. When I went back to school in England, I said the things that my father had said, which was that the English government was behaving very badly, and that made me very unpopular in the school in England. So you did learn to camouflage yourself. You also learned to see that things were not always as they seem, and that you had to look underneath the surface to be able to understand what was going on.
And of course, writing has been over 50 years already, since writing for theater, writing for cinema. Do you remember your first your first play, your first book to be published, your first. Do you remember? Do you have?
Well, I do. I remember all of that. I remember I started to write plays when I was 8 or 9 years old at school in Egypt, where we put them on in the classroom, and that continued when I went back to. So I always wanted to be a writer. I have no idea why. There was no literary background in my family. My father was always very, very encouraging, even though he didn't quite, I think, grasp what being a writer might mean. But as soon as I said I wanted to be a writer when I was about 10 years old, he said, "Wonderful, that's great. Start writing now." And I think that was very helpful to me, that I wasn't at home stopped from, discouraged from this kind of thing. And so, yes, I wrote, I think the first substantial piece of work that I did, I wrote a novel when I was about 16, which was not very good, but it was long, so it gave me a lot of practice in writing. And then when I was 18 years old, I wrote a play called When Did You Last See My Mother, which was first done at university and then finally done in London and in New York, and began my career. So I've never really had a proper job of work. I've only ever been a writer.
1973, just before I was born, Savages. I think that's your piece that connects to the Portuguese-speaking world.
Yes.
Brazil, the Indians, the genocide, and of course, no holding back. Even the missionaries got. Could you just tell us a little bit about that, writing that piece, and why did you write such a piece? And definitely because we know it was controversial.
Well, I read an article there was a wonderful old writer called Norman Lewis, an English writer who lived till he was 100, and he, in the early 70s, wrote a piece that I read about the systematic annihilation of the Brazilian Indians by various commercial interests. And I was particularly struck by a passage in his article which talked about how there was a particular company that was having a lot of trouble getting rid of the Indians in this area of the Xingu, and they hired an expert who told them that every couple of years the Indians would all come from all their different villages and gather in a particular village for this ceremony called the Kwarup, which was simultaneously the burial of somebody of chiefly birth who had died, and also the marriage of all the girls in the tribe, the girls who had reached puberty, and a great celebration over a weekend. And when the expert had told him about this, he hired a couple of mercenaries and a Cessna plane and bombed them during the course of their theatrical ceremony. So that was the original idea for the play. And it was set in the early 70s in Brazil, which was, of course, the time of the military dictatorship, when it had become almost an annual event that ambassadors or consuls were kidnapped by the Brazilian revolutionary movement and exchanged for hostages. So the play is about an English first secretary at the embassy who is himself very interested in the Indians and is writing poems about what's happening with the Indians, who is kidnapped. So the play is about the political upheaval in Brazil, set against this systematic killing of the Indians, What was interesting was that I went to Brazil to research it and realized that the vast majority of the population of Brazil didn't even know that there was a problem with the Indians. They didn't even know there were any Indians in Brazil, and so somehow this dilemma, or this plight, which was a kind of a liberal concern in Europe, was not really an important concern within the country, because they had within Brazil, because they had so many more pressing problems of their own, not only the poverty but also the dictatorship, which was extremely oppressive, I think, and so that was the background of the play, which we did eventually in London in 1973.
And what happened when you did it in London?
Well, we were lucky enough to get one of the greatest English actors, called Paul Schofield, to play the main role. But there was a formal protest from the Brazilian embassy to the Foreign Office in London, and a further protest from the Foreign Office to the Arts Council that supplied the theatre with its money. And we had to, for example, we had a Brazilian flag outside of the theatre, which we had to take down. We had to stop playing the Brazilian national anthem in the course of the play. There was a certain amount of unpleasantness. On the other hand, the play was rather successful and moved from that theatre into the West End, where it ran for nearly a year, and then was performed quite a lot over America, where it had a sort of stronger political effect, because the theatre in Los Angeles, called the Mark Taper Forum Theatre, which first performed the play, listed in the program the 10 American companies that were most heavily involved in investment in Brazil, and asked people who came to see the play to check their portfolios, and if they had investments in any of these companies, to withdraw their investments. So that also caused a certain amount of...
Just a little bit, maybe. But even though over 40 years have passed, I have a feeling that maybe we need a Portuguese version of this play nowadays, because so much is still going on, and of course with the Amazon.
Well, yes. In fact, there's a wonderful English actor called Simon McBurney, who formed a company called the Théâtre de Complicité, and he at this moment is doing a piece about the current conditions in the Amazon. So it clearly is a subject which is still very, very urgent.
Besides, of course, your own work. When I went to university, we had in this course, we talked a lot about adaptations and translations. And looking at all your work, you've got quite a few of those. What gives you the
I was a language student at university, so my subjects were French and German, and I've always been very interested in the art of translation, which I think is very underrated. I think it's a very difficult thing to do, and I think translators are not properly valued, really. But I started when I was very young, translating plays for the theatre that I was working at, which was called the Royal Court Theatre in London, and they had what in the late 60s was this kind of a new idea, which was that when they were going to do classic plays, Chekhov or Ibsen, they would not do the standard academic translation that everybody else did. They would get playwrights to make new versions, and of course, when you think of it, it's an absolutely obvious idea, because their reasoning was that it's more difficult to write dialogue for actors than it is to translate. So they started to. And I was working in the theatre. I was part of the staff of the theatre, so I was hired to do a new translation of Hedda Gabler and a translation of Uncle Vanya, and so on. So I began to enjoy translating, and then later on I began to start looking for living writers to translate. So I found a French writer called Yasmina Reza and translated a play called Art, and several other of her plays. And most recently I found a playwright called Florian Zeller, and I've started to translate I've done 3 of his plays in the last year. One called The Father.
That's the latest award that...
The Father, the actor playing the father, both in London won an Olivier Award and in America won a Tony Award, because it's a wonderful part for an actor. And the latest play of his, which is called The Truth, opens in London on Monday.
So hopefully the weather will be good, and you'll make it on time. The arrival was a little shaky, but got you to go through Pico.
We went through Pico.
Went through nice. Pico Island. There you go. You know. Of course, you've been able to work with so many stars. Your work on films, from writing to directing. Did that change things along the way, or is it basically the same thing? You just write because that's the story you want to tell, and.
Well, I think, if people ask me what I do, I think what I normally say is that I write for actors. I feel that's what I do, and I've been very lucky to work with a number of great actors. From Anthony Hopkins to Julia Roberts to Antonio Banderas to Emma Thompson. All along the way, I've had a great relationship with actors. And so yes, so I feel I feel very privileged to have worked with so many good actors. And
of course, I think you're far away from being ready for your close-up. You're one of the hardest working men. This year, how many pieces have you done? How many works have you done this year?
Well, there have been about, I think, 4 or 5 plays in London. And then 20 years ago, I did a libretto for a musical, Sunset Boulevard, which we did in America with Glenn Close, and we've just revived that with Glenn Close in London. So I've had, it's been one of my busiest years this year so far.
And from what I hear, big stars are jumping in for the film version.
Well, we haven't. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the part belongs to Glenn Close, and I worked with her before on a film called Dangerous Liaison, so I know her very well, and she's just played the part in London. She's older now, 20 years on, but she's playing it more deeply now, really, than she did before, and I think she really is ready for her close-up.
Yeah, I believe so. And now that you're here, it's your first time as an adult coming to Azores. Maybe this will inspire you to.
Well, it's quite strange to. I mean, yesterday I walked down the street where I was born, and it is quite a strange feeling to be here. Of course, it's very beautiful here, and I feel at home.
I feel a play or a film will come one day, and you can come and shoot here, film here. You never know, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Of course, throughout the years, many awards, for your work, and the one that most people, of course, remember or know is the Oscar. For you, what does that mean when you receive awards from your peers?
Well, it's very nice. The Oscar is quite a sort of double-edged. That's to say that I was delighted to receive the Oscar, and then I thought the things that I wrote after that would be that much easier to get filmed. So immediately after winning the Oscar, I chose to write a film about the that disappeared, the desaparecidos in Argentina, and discovered immediately that winning an Oscar meant nothing when it comes to financing a difficult subject. And in fact, it took me 14 years to get the film made. And in the 6 years after the Oscar, none of the projects I wrote were made until a film called Carrington, which was the first film I directed, and I only really directed it because we couldn't find anyone else to do it. So it was, you know, it was an amazing experience to go out to Los Angeles and come home with this thing, but not exactly what one might have imagined.
Searching, I found this sentence that I believe it was from you. I don't know. I'm going to read it and see if you remember. Just because, you know, it's one of the things we always talk in the arts, which is critics. As pessoas que sabem tudo mais do que a gente. People that always seem to know more than we do them when we're doing art. Asking a working writer what he thinks about critics is like asking a lamppost what it feels about dogs.
I did.
Do you remember that?
Yeah. There's a great English writer called John Osborne, who was, I can't remember the circumstances, but he was writing to all his writer friends and saying, what do you think about critics? How have they helped you? Have they helped you? And in fact, what you just read out was the postcard that I sent to him in answer to his question.
After all these years, and of course you're working now more than most people I know that are in the business, what would you say to young people starting out that want to live their world in the arts?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is only do it if you can't think of anything else to do. I mean, only do it if you feel that you have to do it. Don't do it if you just feel you'd quite like to do it, because it does demand, I mean, it's a very up and down, inevitably a very up and down existence. And it's quite an intense existence. And I think if there's any way of avoiding it, then do so.
As you mentioned before, your father, Bernard Patrick Hampton, was here as a marine telecommunications engineer for the cable and wireless. And I know some people in the audience have the connection to Christopher's father. And this would be a great time to either... Zeca, tens microfone aqui. If anybody wants to share anything or ask anything in terms of that connection directly to Fayal and what brought Christopher back. Do you want some water or anything?
No, I'm fine, thanks. Yes. Yes, please do.
O senhor fala português?
Falo?
Português. Está bem, então está-te a explicar. Eu vou explicar primeiro em português, depois vou aí entregar isto ao senhor. É preciso microfone, não é?
É melhor para todos ouvirem.
É o seguinte, quando soube que o senhor vinha...
Sim.
Alô! Quando soube que este senhor vinha e o nome dele, e que o pai dele tinha trabalhado aqui nas companhias do Cabo Submarino, eu tive a curiosidade de ir ao registro. Eu tenho um registro lá de todos os empregados da companhia inglesa, porque quando as companhias fecharam, eu fico com algum espólio daquelas coisas. Entre elas, documentos, livros, etc. Como eu sou interessado por essas coisas, guardei sempre aquilo. E tive imediatamente a ideia de ir lá verificar no registro se existia lá o nome do senhor. E estava lá, realmente. Tirei uma fotocópia. E agora, tinha muito prazer em vir aqui entregá-la.
Mas o senhor fala inglês?
Fala
inglês, pode dizer mesmo aí.
Posso ir aí?
Claro, venha.
E a quem é que eu entrego?
Fala inglês, venha cá. probably able to understand half of it.
A little bit, yes.
Things in English, but it's not as good as you are.
Oh, no problem.
My English may not be enough for you to understand.
Go ahead, try it.
Come on over. Come on over.
I'll do my best.
You can speak to Christopher and...
Okay. I worked for the Western Union
Yes,
for 5 years, but a lot of time after your father.
take a seat.
So your father entered here in 1945,
Yes.
and this register is exactly, that's the Europe and the Azores Telegraph Company.
Yes, yes.
That's the name of your father.
Yes.
And what happened with him when you left? He left in 48.
Amazing.
So
Well, now I know when I left.
yeah, no, not when you left.
No, I do know. That's when I
You were
left.
born in this interval.
Yes, I was born in
It
46.
couldn't be otherwise.
46.
Quando eu saí
46.
com o pai.
If the father was here in 46,
Then I was 2 years old when I left.
so I'll let you have this.
That is very, very
if you like
exciting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
If you want to roll it with this.
Okay, no, this is absolutely... I'm going to read it first.
Com bom português, vem com
I see his annual salary was £540.
Okay. That's historic
Yes.
document.
Yes.
That's
It's a
what
little
they
bit.
say in English.
It's a little bit more than.
Historic document.
It's a little bit more than the current fare
That's
from
enough.
London to.
My name, Carlos Silveira.
Carlos Silveira. Muito obrigado.
Thank you so much.
I'll let you have this.
Carlos Silveira. Carlos Silveira.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Wow.
Who's got something else to share or a story or... Come on up. Come here.
So it says he left for UK via Madrid.
He's now excited.
Very surprising.
You wanna
No,
share-
Madeira. Via Madeira. I beg your pardon. Health good. Character good.
There's nothing bad about it, is there?
No, promotion, yes. Wow. This is most interesting. Thank you very much.
Yes, welcome to Fayal.
Thank you.
When I saw that you were coming, I was really quite moved for many reasons. One of them is that you were born very close to the day I was born,
Oh,
in this same place. And so I was born in Fayal, and I am from Fayal. And I then went to England. I've been in England for 44 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I started looking at all sorts of things. And so, for instance, you are an alumni of New College,
Yes.
which my son is an alumni of New College. My husband is British. And then got quite interested in what you have been doing. And the fact that you are Fayalense yourself, like myself, I want to ask you a question which I have had for over 20 years. I think when Portugal joined the EU,
Yes.
somebody, and I'm not sure if it was the British Council, but somebody paid for a group of musicians from the Halle Orchestra to come and play in the Azores. I think it's, I know, the Azores are the most extreme west part of Europe. And they came here. One of the violin players that came was, at the time, the violin teacher of one of our sons. And when she got back to Manchester, which is where we live when we are in England, she told me that this theatre would be the ideal place to perform Shakespeare's plays.
Well, you know, it is very like, the proportions are very like a Shakespearean theatre.
I would be, well, I am very pleased to hear from your mouth to these people that live here, because people in England who have a variety of theatres, including theatres that have been built to be, or to copy the real Shakespeare's theatres.
Yes.
If you could convince these people this is quite amazing, then we might see more people coming to the theatre.
Well, the theatre that when I began to work in the theatre in London, I got a job at the Royal Court Theatre, which was the theatre that in 1956 started a crusade for new writing in England. And looking at the stage and looking at the auditorium, it has very much the same intimate relationship, which is not always the case with proscenium theatres. Quite often but I think this has beautiful proportions. I don't know about the upstairs, which are interesting looking. I mean, it's all these boxes, but the relationship between the stage and the auditorium seems to me more or less perfect, I think.
Thank you. That's quite special, mainly because this year this house is celebrating 100 years, so it's very nice to know.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful theatre, so I wish you joy of it, and I hope you use it a lot in the coming years, because it's. I was surprised when I came in by how beautiful it was.
Thank you. And my last question is, what do you think of Fayal and Pico? Because the best of Fayal is said to be Pico.
Is that right?
So I don't know, I'm Fayalese, I wouldn't agree with that, but
it was raining very hard in Pico, so Fayal seems much nicer to me.
Thank you. Welcome.
Obrigado, thanks.
Thank you.
Does anybody have, mas alguém quer fazer uma pergunta, ou um comentário, ou algo para partilhar? Mais ninguém? Não querem mais? Em geral? Em português ou em inglês? In general? In terms of a comment in general, or a question, or something you would like to share in regards to what we're talking about tonight?
Hi.
Hello.
Artists have a very conflicting relationship with their hometowns usually. So what were your expectations initially? I mean, before visiting the island?
Well, luckily I had no time to have a conflicting relationship with my hometown because I was 2 years old. So I've only ever been fascinated by the idea. My brother, who's here this evening, is a little older than me, so he had very much clearer. He had memories. I had no memories. He had memories of the island, and in fact came back 20 years ago with my mother because they wanted to come back and visit again. My father's predecessor, also working for Cable and Wireless, was my uncle and his wife, who was my mother's sister. So my slightly older cousin was born in the same bed as I was born in the Rue Consul d'Abney, and so we have a lot of family ties with the island. But mostly I wanted to come because I couldn't remember it, and so I wanted to see it for myself, and so it's been I'm very happy to have been invited.
Well, I'm so glad that message got to you, and that you're here. And you said, "Oh, I must visit," which is fantastic. Mr. John Ross is not here. He is. You mentioned to me the other day that you knew somebody that actually worked with Christopher's dad, correct? The microphone.
Yes, there's a gentleman by the name of Fernando Morrison who actually still lives in the bungalow next to the bungalow that you were brought up in.
Wow.
He wanted to come and see you. I don't see him here, so perhaps his wife didn't let him out this late tonight. Strangely enough, this evening as well, I met a lady from Fayal who now lives in London, and she was actually a teacher of your brother before he left. And at least that's what she
He's
told
right
me.
in front of you.
He's right in front of you, yes.
Do you remember? Yes, her name is... her name is now Greaves, and she asked me to ask you if you were the person she used to teach, because apparently she used to teach the English people. She's still alive, which is pretty good going for many of them.
Wow, you must visit.
I also know somebody who's a neighbour of mine and a colleague in the heritage job that I do in England by the name of John, and he worked with your father here as well.
Yes.
And he remembered you. Well, remembered your father. So that was in a conversation, not in any way related to your visit here. I didn't know you existed at that time, but
Wow.
his name came up in conversation.
Well, that's,
As a great guy, actually, your father.
yes,
has a
no,
good
he was.
reputation.
I'm happy to say he was a popular man and a very kind man, and is well remembered by a lot of people.
Well, I'm glad you're enjoying your stay here anyway.
Thank you.
This is fantastic. I think there's going to be some visits to do in the next
Indeed.
couple of days. Somebody else over there? Quem estava ali?
Thank you. Actually, I'll stand up. Well, thanks for being here. And I'm interested in asking more of a story question, how you come up with stories. And I've been thinking a lot about how writing works lately. So I'm just wondering, in your mind, when you come up with a story, and I'm sure it's different ways sometimes too, but do you have is there a germination of an idea or an image or a story from real life, like you said in the case of Brazil with genocidal behavior?
Yeah.
Or is it, or do you have a story laid out or themes that you're working backwards from, or do you more have images and an idea and then you put the story onto that, rather having more of a thematic or metaphorical positions of characters, ideas that you work backwards from?
Well, there are various different sorts of germination. I mean, sometimes you have an original idea which is a fictional idea, and you try to grow a plot from that. That's almost the most difficult. Or you take a historical subject. In my case, I've often written about artists and real artists, and investigated their lives, and then used them to I guess push a particular point or other. Or there are sort of political subjects which exercise you and which interest you and which cause you to, like the play we were talking about Brazil, which was really a political idea. But the thing is that numbers of ideas, I guess, pass through your head in the course of any particular year, and they pass in. You think about them for a minute and then they're gone. But for reasons which are not understandable really by me, there are certain ideas that then attach themselves like a burr to your brain, which become the subjects you want to write about. But I don't know why that happens. I don't know why this subject is interesting and this subject is not interesting. That's really a question of personal temperament, I suppose. So there are no rules. And in fact, what I've mostly tried to do in my career is always do something completely different from the thing I did before, so that the play about the Brazilian Indians immediately followed a play which was a formal sort of Molière-esque comedy set in a university. And one of the things that most, apart from the political passion that I felt, one of the main attractions of the play Savages, set in Brazil, was it was so different from the last play that I wrote. And I think there are certain kinds of writers and artists who form a style so that you can, for example, let's take Harold Pinter. You see a play by Harold Pinter, you know it's a play by Harold Pinter. He has a style, same with Samuel Beckett. There are other writers who try to somehow submerge their personality into the subject that they're working on and try to come from different angles all the time. And indeed, when you look at their career, you think, what is it that links this bit of the career to that bit of the career? And if you ask them, if you ask me, I wouldn't know. It's just that I'm very interested in kind of hiding, I suppose, behind the subject or delivering the subject without putting upon it the impress of my own opinions or my own personality. Of course I have opinions, and of course I hope I have a personality, but they're not the things that are crucial to me in writing a play. I always think each subject demands its own style, and each medium, stage, film, television, opera, musical, they all require different facets of your writing talent, and what's interesting is to exploit all those different possibilities.
Well, one of the latest films, Met Brioso. Now I have the Portuguese name in my mind. I can't.
Yes.
The Freud.
Yes. This was a play that was originally called The Talking Cure, which we did at the National Theatre in London with Ralph Fiennes in 2002. And then, I think 4 or 5 years after the play had run, I had a call from David Cronenberg, the Canadian director, asking me if I would like to do a film of it. So I think about 4 or 5 years ago.
Dangerous Method.
It was called, but the film was called A Dangerous Method, only because David Cronenberg had made a film called A History of Violence, and he had got it into his head that the film, because it had an academic title, had made much less money than it should have done, and therefore he thought to call a film A Talking Cure would have the same problem. So he invented this name, A Dangerous Method.
And it did really well.
Yeah, it did fine. So he was right. And also he was fascinating to work with, because one of the things I tried to learn over the last 40 years was to teach myself what I knew already, which is the enormous difference between writing for the stage and writing for the screen. And so when I wrote A Dangerous Method, I tried to make it a proper movie. And David Cronenberg said, no, I prefer the play. Can we go back towards the play? Mm-hmm. So he moved the script back towards the play. So the film is really quite like the play. And we made it in Germany, and it's set mostly in Switzerland, but we couldn't afford to shoot in Switzerland. Nobody can afford to shoot in Switzerland. So we shot it mostly in Germany. It was, I think, the third of my plays to be made into a film. It's always very, very interesting to see, to evaluate and to see the differences between a piece of work that you've written for the theatre and its film version.
But you're part of it, so you still have a lot of say. Has there been any works that you then passed on and somebody else did with you not being part of?
No, I have always, whenever a theatre play of mine has gone onto the cinema, and the same will happen, I hope, with Sunset Boulevard this year. Whenever something I've worked on goes to film, I've always written it, with the exception of once or twice, once actually, I translated a play called The God of Carnage, and that was made into a film by Polanski a couple of years ago without my participation. But generally speaking, I try to keep hold of the projects all along the line.
There is one more question here. Where's the microphone? O microfone, onde é que foi ter? Ah, tá. Mais alguém tem algum comentário ou questão?
Hi, Christopher. First
Hello.
of all, I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to hear you speak. My name is Patricia, and I've got 2 screenplays in development hell. So I wanted to ask you, as a writer, I have 2 questions. One is, how do you navigate the craziness of who needs to make the decision? You start with, we need a director first, you need a producer first, round and round and round. And what is really the writer's involvement when the story?
Film is a very unforgiving medium for writers. In other words, in the theatre, there's no doubt that the most important person is the writer. In the cinema, the most important person is the director. And the whole process is so weird and irrational that you can't really make any rules at all. I've written over more than 50 screenplays. 17 of them have been made into films. That's maybe one in 3. That's great. That's great, but on the other hand, it means that 35 of them have not been made into films, and which is a lot of work. So when you write a film, you go into the casino. You sit at the roulette table, and you put your money on 23, and your chances are about the same. And it's never to do with anything rational. It's never to do with anything sensible. In other words, the film Dangerous Liaison, which was, I suppose, my greatest success and what I'm best known for, should not, by any proper rules, have been made at all. It was completely a fluke that it was made. It was completely illogical that the film was made, because before we started to make it, Milos Forman, who was then the most successful film director in the world, who had the Oscar for 2 films running, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Amadeus, announced that he was going to make a film based on Les Liaisons Dangereuses. So, had it not been for the pure luck of the fact that the company that had bought my rights to my play was in the process of going bankrupt. So they were about to go bankrupt, and they had a meeting and said, well, if we're going bankrupt, what the hell difference does it make if we make this film or not? Wow. So they financed the film, whereas any of the big studios, as soon as they saw coming over the horizon the biggest film director in the world, would have said, well, get rid of that. So that's the only reason the film got made. So there is no sanity or sense or logic in the film industry to this day. And now, of course, that television has become so preeminent and so interesting, the same applies to television. In other words, television has become as when I started in the 70s, I wrote a lot of television, and it was wonderful because you wrote the thing, they did it. You wrote it, you handed it in, 6 months later it was on the television. Now, it's just as complicated as the movies, and it's just as capricious, and it's just as nerve-wracking. So, you know, anybody with any sense would stick in the theatre. But I happen to like films, and in fact, my father was very, very fond of films, and from the age of about 6 years old, when we were in Egypt, he would take me to the cinema 2 or 3 times a week. So I kind of grew up with the American cinema, and that's deeply imprinted in me. And so as soon as I was able to, in fact, right away, I wrote my first film, I think, when I was 20. So it wasn't any good, but anyway, I wrote it because I always wanted to write films.
And now you're doing a television series, or is that over already?
I'm doing 2 television series, but I have no means of predicting when or if ever they will be on your television, because one of them is with the BBC, and it's like, I started it 3 years ago, and it's just pushing a pea up the mountain with your nose. And the other is for American television, where there was euphoria about 7 or 8 months ago because Martin Scorsese said he wanted to produce it and he would direct a couple of the episodes, and Scarlett Johansson said she would be in it, and since then there's been complete silence. So you don't know whether this will happen or whether it will not happen. It's dependent on whether these extremely busy artists find a little hole where they can do it. And you just have to wait and see.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. This has been lovely, and I hope we all understand that this is a great moment for the theater and for us here in the Azores. O diretor regional de turismo veio conhecer o Christopher esta tarde. The director of tourism came to say hi, which was nice. I don't know if there's anyone here from the town hall, a cidade da Horta, ou do governo dos Açores, que queira dizer alguma coisa ou não. Está tudo caladinho. Mas isto é um daqueles momentos, não temos um Nobel, mas temos um vencedor de Oscar que não tem medo de ter na sua biografia que nasceu no Faial, nos Açores, porque nós todos conhecemos muitas pessoas que nasceram aqui, viveram aqui, mas só quando ficaram famosos em Hollywood ou isso assim, desapareceu a parte portuguesa. So it's great to have you here. Thanks so much for coming. We do not have an Oscar, but we have Atlante. Atlante is our mascot, which symbolizes persistence and boldness. And I want you to take Atlante with you for being here with us. So thank you very much, Christopher.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for making me so welcome. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.